What up? Merry Christmas, or close enough. And we have an early Christmas gift for you here in the form of this plant druid. This character absolutely destroyed the campaign, and it was a joy to play. We didn't throw any kind of fancy gear or uniques or anything at this character either. Like, this wasn't a full SSF run, but it was pretty close, you know, like 70% or whatever. We used a few exalts from the stash along the way. That was pretty much it. And it absolutely blew the doors off of everything in the campaign. So before we jump into it, help us out with that YouTube busy work, like, subscribe, and hype the video if you're on mobile. These all tell YouTube to show our content to more people, which helps us keep doing this. Alright, let's talk about the build. So this is a really simple character. It's a plant druid, and you really only have a handful of different skills available to you to even work with. Entangle, you're able to pick up at level 1. Technically, you have to get to town first, so I guess level 2. But you can craft it with your first skill gem, and then just kind of run out shooting vines at everything and killing it pretty easily. Now, the intended basic design of Entangle and Thrashing Vines, your two main vine skills, is that they are these like very long-lasting sort of damage over time skills, but we're able to change that really easily with a keystone that we pick up pretty early on in the campaign, usually right around the end of Act 1 or the beginning of Act 2, called Wild Surge Incantation. And what this does is it increases the damage of your storm and plant skills, and makes them cost way less mana, but also have less duration. So what it does is it changes them from being utility-based, long-lasting skills into more direct damage skills. So Entangle deals a fair amount of damage on its own, and it creates fissures on the ground. That's effectively how it works, as you can see from throwing it around here, right? It's creating fissures on the ground. You're able to spread these out a bunch more with the support gems, Branching Fissures 1 and 2. These are fantastic. If you are playing a character that is not your first to the league, you should probably start, the very first thing you do is make a Branching Fissures 2 with a level 5 support gem. That was kind of my one cheat of the character in the campaign, was I started with a Branching Fissures 2 after, like, I don't know, level 5 or so. I realized, like, yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and jump right to doing that. And then Entangle basically just covers rooms and vines, and they do a ton of direct damage when they first go out, and then they also do a bunch of damage over time while they're sitting out, attaching to enemies and doing damage and slowing them. And that's really the huge selling point of this build, right? It does a lot of damage, it covers off screen, it slows enemies constantly, so it's like incredibly hard for enemies to ever hit you. You're also pretty tanky in the campaign for a campaign character that was running mostly campaign gear. This was a pretty tanky experience, certainly a lot more so than like Ranger League Start, for example. Also, you know, we haven't really played a ton of casters in PoE 2 compared to the amount of like melee and bow builds, and now actually dabbling in some caster stuff. You know what? Maybe Reddit has a point. Maybe there is sort of a caster bias in this game, because wow, this felt a lot easier than playing melee. Alright, so we've cooked up a very simple Mobalytics guide, and there's a PoB attached to that as well, and we're just going to kind of run through that. We'll run through the skills that you use during the campaign as well. So we do have recommended skills for each of the 4 acts, you know, and the intermissions, interludes, and then just like a very rudimentary in-game setup that is definitely something we're still going to work on. Like, this is very much a campaign approach type of video, just something we're talking about, like the first experience with Plant Druid over the first couple of days, and then we're definitely going to be pushing this further because it was incredibly fun in the campaign. It has felt insane in the first like 20 minutes of mapping. But that's where we're at right now, right? Like, we're not waiting until we've cleared all of the Uber bosses to start talking about this. We'll get to that later. So, starting with the skills, you get Entangle at level 1. Upheaval and Magnified Area are things you can use immediately. Although, again, if you can throw a Branching Fissures 2 onto that Entangle from level 2, that's going to do you a lot of good. Volcano is something you're going to get very quickly as well. It's not, like, super great synergistically whatever wise, like synergy wise, it's not amazing, but you can throw it down and then throw Entangles over the top of it. This is probably the thing you're going to run into the most difficulty with on the character. It's the very start of leveling. If you're just trying to blast with Entangle, you can get a decent staff, like a spell damage staff or wand, and do some okay damage. But this is probably the weakest that you're ever going to feel. It's kind of always that way on all characters, right? Then after a little while, I think around level 14 is when you pick up Thunderstorm, and this gives you really good synergy because something that all the plant skills have in common is that if you have a Thunderstorm over them, it will cause them to overgrow and do something else. And so the way that the two skills work, like Entangle, makes it so that the overgrown fissures expire slower, and the vines that they attach to enemies they're able to attach more, do more damage, basically slow enemies more. And so that's basically how you play when you're fighting a boss, right? You throw the thunderstorm down, then you cast vines over the top of it. Repeat, repeat, repeat. As soon as the thunderstorm despawns, you throw it down again, and then vine over the top of it, and just continue to do that. Pretty simple. The main reason that you need to recast Thunderstorm fairly often is you'll be fighting a boss and then they're going to move around the room on you, and that's, that's a little annoying, but honestly, it's pretty easy to deal with. Now, eventually you're going to switch out of hand casting Thunderstorm and move over to having it on cast on crit, but that's not really until like the end of the intermissions. But once you get to that point, you're going to have cast on crit, automating your Thunderstorm. That's going to make the whole process way easier. It's going to cut down on the amount of like keybinds during bosses where you're basically able to just do a 2-button play style on bosses. Now, as for your next skill, Thrashing Vines, you're not able to get until Act 3. I believe this is like a level 9 skill gem, if I remember correctly, and this one works a little bit differently from Entangle, which, as you can see, Entangle shoots these vines off screen. Thrashing Vines basically just spawns like a little circle of vines, as you can see, they're going off here, that kind of attack in a small area, a small radius, and something that's a little funky about the way that Thrashing Vines works is this line right here. 2 vines grow per cast time, so you actually get more vines based on the duration of the cast. So this is like one skill where you don't really have an incentive to be super duper fast, and one of the skills or one of the support gems that they recommend using is Considered Casting, and it's kind of all upside. Slower cast, more damage, and then, you get more damage per cast because of Thrashing Vines working the way that it does. So Thrashing Vines is, I think, one of the skills that the Root Dredge, or whatever his name is, in the Grellwood uses, except instead of being purple, it's green. But basically, you just throw this down every so often. You want to look at the duration on it, 4.5 seconds. All right. You cast it down every 4.5 seconds, and then you just fill with Entangle in between. And if you haven't unlocked Cast on Crit yet, then you're going to also maintain Thunderstorm, but that's pretty much it. You just have a couple of maintenance buffs, Thunderstorm, Thrashing Vines, and then you're filling with Entangle as much as you can. Then there's Tornado. You're not able to pick this up until quite a lot later on. Again, this is like Act 3, maybe beginning of Act 4 is when you pick up Tornado, and it's not nearly as important or really as useful, but it's just kind of fun to throw in. It's just another maintenance buff skill that you can throw down along with Thunderstorm and Thrashing Vines on single targets, and what it does is it sits in place and does a bunch of damage, and that's kind of it. If there are ground effects of any kind, fiery ground, chilling ground, shocking ground, then it will suck up that damage type and do a bunch of extra damage of that element, and then also potentially apply that debuff as well. And so that was like one little fun thing in playing around with Tornado, but mostly it's there to look cool. Like, you don't have to use it. I did try playing with it in Cast on Crit. It didn't really seem that useful. Compared to just having Thunderstorm in there for like better single target. Then a little thing that we're able to throw in early on in Act 1 is Pounce. Pounce is a very basic werewolf skill, and so in order to use that, you are going to need some sort of talisman. It doesn't really need to be a high damage talisman at all. And what Pounce does is exactly that. Like, it leaps to a spot on the ground, so you can use it for mobility, or you can use it to gap close on enemies, and then it'll put a mark on an enemy. Once you get a level 2 support gem, you can make Mark for Death level 1. Later on, you can make Mark for Death level 2. And what this does is it makes it so that all of your physical damage will break enemy armor, and that works with the Predator's mark that comes from Pounce. This also randomly spawns some wolves if you kill enemies that are marked. We're basically only using this to break armor on bosses and like super tanky rares, but it's something you can play around with. It's shockingly good during the campaign to just get that armor break, because all of our spell damage is physical. Entangle and Thrashing Vines are both physical, and if we break enemy armor, that's going to mean we're doing more damage. If we break it all, then you're going to take 20% increased damage from all of our physical damage sources, so that's really huge. Also, just to kind of hit on a couple of other things here, Accelerated Growth is a bonus that triggers like just basically some extra damage. It does a lot of extra damage actually if we overgrow plants, which is another reason that we're using that Thunderstorm interaction. And then Heft, Heft is useful on both of these two skills since they do all physical damage. And then like Magnified Area on Entangle is super important for covering maximum area, right? Whereas Concentrated Area on Thrashing Vines makes more sense for really boiling it down into a small zone of damage for killing bosses. Now, Thunderstorm is able to add a lot of value. Like, it increases the chance for enemies to be shocked, but if we combine that with Shock Conduction too, then it's just guaranteed. They're always going to be shocked. And then we're also able to get Coursing Current during the campaign is really helpful. We're able to get a lot of extra damage out of this. It just does like some chain lightning on shocked enemies. So if you combine that with Shock Conduction 2 and Thunderstorm, and then you're basically just going to be like blasting any packs of enemies that you throw Thunderstorm onto. Thunderstorm doesn't really do a lot of damage on its own. The whole point of it really is just to like shock enemies so they take extra damage, and also like pop all the accelerated growths and, you know, juice up our Entangle and our Thrashing Vine to make them deal more damage. Thrashing Vine's is bonus for being overgrown. It said it does more damage. I mean, simple, but like, who doesn't want more damage, right? Now, the one thing that's a little bit janky in the campaign is auras. The first aura option, all of the Druid auras are literally worthless for casters. Maybe this is something that'll make more sense once Templar gets added to the game, but it's all like Heralds, which are only able to work with attack skills. Arctic Armor you can take from Sorceress. That was ultimately the direction we went. Don't feel great about it, but you know, it's what we did. And then for your second aura, we played around with Bark Skin, which is a cool idea. It's not amazing or anything. Like, basically, Bark Skin gives you armor based on any energy shield you lose, which is like pretty cool, but you have to lose a lot of energy shield for that to add up to a lot of armor, and yeah, that really wasn't ever happening. Not in the campaign, not with campaign gear. So this is an interesting idea for an aura, but really not that important. And then once you get to Act 4, well, the intermissions, and you're able to get cast on crit, that's basically all you're going to blow your spirit on anyways. So that's kind of where we're at. There are some options once you get into end-game, like Convalescence. This is something that was on our radar. We saw a Reddit post about this a couple of days ago saying, like, this is absolutely cracked for Energy Shield builds, and that was kind of the plan for this build anyway, was to go Energy Shield, so obviously running this along with a ton of Energy Shield is going to work really well. And so that's pretty much it for skills. Like, it's shockingly simple. You know, it really is just like run through maps, right-clicking 90% of the time through the campaign, and through maps, you're just running around entangling and everything dies. Now let's talk about the tree, and let's kind of talk about the progression through the tree from like level 1 on. So your first set of points, you're going to come out here and take some of these really nice hybrid damage nodes. Harbinger of Disaster is pretty cool. Lasting Incantations and Wasting Casts are like pretty nice, but the real big moneymaker is up here. Wild Surge Incantation is the thing that gives you super huge tons of damage. So you can kind of take some of these early spell damage nodes, and then once you get enough points to spec up here, you can spec out of these and go take Wild Surge Incantation and then make your way back to these later. This path here with Boundless Growth and Constricting is really nice for adding a bunch of extra plant damage. All of this cluster in the middle here is great for plant damage. And then you get your first Ascendancy, and let's talk a little bit about the rest of the tree before we go off to Ascendancies. But yeah, the Ascendancies are all really good for Oracle. Then you pretty much just keep expanding the rest of the tree out. Dangerous Blossom adds a lot of damage. Proliferating Weeds is something that you can maybe play around with. You get +1 limit on your Entangle. It may not actually be that great or worth taking, to be honest. Like, it's not a huge damage increase to get 1 extra Fissure, but, you know, something you can play around with depending on how much skill duration you have. We're also taking some, like, basic Arcane Surge uptime, and just, like, some mana regen helps as a caster. That's pretty much it, right? Like, it's a very simple tree. We're just taking a lot of damage nodes until we get into the end game, and we take the Ascendancy node, Entwined Realities, that lets us, like, basically turn all keystones into from nothing jewels, but, you know. So now let's talk about the Oracle Ascendancy. This is one of the most fascinating Ascendancies in the game. The first nodes you're going to take are probably the Unseen Path. The Paths Not Taken opens up all of these wispy little trees, like these little tree segments around the passive tree that you're able to pick up, like these bonuses like Calculated Hunter or Limitless Pursuit. This one adds a ton of movement speed and cooldown recovery. They're sort of like off meta, off of the intended approach of the Ascendancy kind of bonuses. There's some very cool stuff in here. Like, there's a lot of poison related stuff, which is interesting, but because of the cap of 1 poison, like we thought about First Sting and Knight's Bite, like with this being a build that has a bunch of physical damage built into it, seems like a cool idea, but overcoming that poison limit while not being a Pathfinder just seems really, really difficult. But there's a lot of interesting stuff added by Unseen Paths, some really good bonuses like Camaraderie, just this giving you a ton of increased damage, or the tons of increased damage that you get out of Deadly Thorns. Just some very basic good stuff. Then the Lesser Harm is something that's not really super interesting or super valuable in the campaign, but it's incredibly good once you get to maps. and that is enemy critical chance against you is unlucky. So basically this means that enemies have to roll a crit hit against you twice and hit both of them in order to crit. So they roll the chance to crit. If either of them doesn't crit, then they don't crit. So the standard crit chance for enemies in this game is like 5%, which means they go from critting you like 5% of the time to critting you less than 1% of the time. They essentially have to roll a successful d20, like a natural 20, twice in a row, which is insanely unlucky. Now, if you're running maps that have, like significant amounts of increased crit on them, like 300% increased crit or whatever, and so that crit chance is more like 15% or 20%, it's a little bit higher, but it's still very, very, very unlikely for enemies to actually roll that like 15% chance to crit 2 times in a row. So this effectively makes you immune to crits. It doesn't actually, but it makes it very unlikely that enemies crit you. Like, it massively reduces the chance to be crit. The second line damage of enemies hitting you is unlucky, also very good, but not as good. Enemies don't have gigantic roll ranges in this game, but like, again, it rolls the damage twice and then takes the lower of the two. Incredibly good. You're also able to use this node over here, desensitization, for enemies have 25% reduced critical damage bonus, which the default is 150 baseline, so that's a huge reduction in the amount of damage that they can even do with a crit, even if they do somehow get lucky and crit you. So this is just an insanely good node here. And then Forced Outcome is one of the strongest nodes that we've ever seen. Basically, it makes it so that all of your attacks and spells crit, no matter what. But it doesn't set your crit chance to 100%. Instead, it rolls the standard crit chance, and if the spell or attack crits, good. If it doesn't, then it rolls it again, but now you have 30% less critical damage bonus. And if that doesn't crit, then it does it again and again and again, until a crit occurs. So what this means is that you are basically rewarded for stacking both crit chance and crit damage bonus by just having more damage all the time, and then you're able to take advantage of some really powerful nodes around the tree and some bonuses from like uniques, for example. Things like Cut to the Bone, which breaks armor on critical hits with spells equal to 10% of physical damage dealt. It just now works like break armor on hit with spells equal to 10% of physical damage dealt, because all of your spell hits are crits. And there are other things too, some stuff that we talked about in the MOBA guide, for example, like Gifts from Above, which gives you increased rarity of items dropped by enemies killed with a crit. Everything you hit is also, it's something that you're critting instead, so that's always going to work every time. So Night Scale is another bonus here. This is just a really good pair of gloves that have an insane amount of crit, like 50% increased critical chance, and they're not even particularly expensive with decent rolls. And they give you an enormous amount of mana regen. They give you no mana regen if you haven't crit recently, but if you're using spells, you've crit recently, and they obviously you can see I'm not regenning mana. They don't turn off your ability to use your flask. This also works incredibly well with cast on crit, as you can imagine, since all of your spells count as critting all the time. You're going to be just filling up cast on crits meter all the time and doing tons of damage from that. So now the final Ascendancy node is Entwined Realities, and this basically just makes it so that any keystones that you take allow you to allocate bonuses around them in a medium range. And that's why we're taking some of these things like Ancestral Bond and Elemental Equilibrium and Black Flame Covenant. We're not using them. We're just using them to get at some really powerful nodes without having to path over to them. Things like Dangerous Blossom and Storm Charged. Potentially Dimensional Weak Spot if you were to get a staff that had damage as extra lightning. Now you can get a chance for that lightning damage to not have to deal with enemy resistances, but actually count as being inverted. And then the same kind of goes with bonus like Stormbreaker, where you're going to be shocking and chilling enemies all the time, so you're going to get a bunch of extra damage out of that too. Alright, so that's the skills, that's the tree. Now let's just talk a little bit about the gear, and really we're just talking about the campaign gear. So mainly what you're looking for is just a good staff or a wand and a focus, but staff is a lot better for damage, and really the main thing is either level of all spell skills or level of physical spell skills. You want that. Increased spell damage, you want that. Cast speed is good if you can get that on your weapon or on your rings, that helps. And then move speed and life and resistances and pretty much all the usual stuff. It's very, very basic, the gearing for this character. This is a staff that I was able to get off of a vendor NPC, I think in Act 4. And very lucky, right? Just slapped a couple of random exalts on it and hey, what do you know? Alright, so that's the build. This has been incredibly fun to play so far, incredibly simple and easy to play as well, and we're definitely looking forward to doing a lot more with it as we push into the end game. Alright, that's it. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and finally thank you to all of our channel members. If you want to support us and help us make more PoE content, consider becoming a channel member as well. Thanks for watching. Bye.